Today, I will be reading 5 true, horrifying ghost stories to keep you awake at night. All stories used will be linked in the description below. Enjoy. Last night was the worst night of my life to date. Something happened that was so terrifying that my boyfriend and I decided to get a hotel room, which was very difficult to do because of COVID lockdown rules. We had to send my cat to my mother's place because we did not want anything happening to it. It started when we had some thunderstorms roll through. My boyfriend and I really enjoy thunderstorm watching on our patio, so we went out with a cup of tea and sat and watched the storm. While we were outside, we heard knocking at our sliding glass door. We assumed it was my cat Missy, so we ignored it for a bit. It kept getting louder and louder until we finally looked to see what it was. The glass was shaking from the pressure of the knocking, but nothing was there. No cat, no person, no nothing. Just the knocking and the panes of glass vibrating. We freaked out for a bit and just stood watching the glass moving and listening to the knocking until the rain started. It was pouring so bad we had to go inside. The knocking stopped as soon as my boyfriend put his hands on the handle. We entered slowly and went into the bedroom, away from the sliding doors. The bedroom looked like it had been turned upside down. The covers were torn off the bed. The nightstand was upside down. All my clothes and my boyfriend's clothes were scattered everywhere, and the cat was hiding under the bed. We cleaned up quickly and went into the kitchen to chill for a bit before bedtime. We did not talk about what had happened, because we did not want to acknowledge it. We just tried to go about our nightly routine and go to bed. That's when all hell broke loose. We were laying in bed while I was on TikTok, and my boyfriend was reading, and we started feeling really scared. My boyfriend just looked at me, and I knew he was feeling what I felt. We shifted closer together and started listening for anything to happen. Our cat, who was at the bottom of the bed, ran out of the room suddenly and made my boyfriend and I more uneasy. That's when we felt it. We felt the bottom of the bed press down and heard the springs compressing. We saw a large dent in the foot of the bed grow until it looked like 2 handprints and 2 knee prints, like someone was on all fours on our bed. All we could do was stare in horror as the prints started moving up towards us slowly. If we tried to get out of bed, we would have to go through whatever was there. It had moved to the point where I had to pull my legs up to my chest to avoid the prints. The prints suddenly disappeared, and my boyfriend and I ran out of the room as fast as possible. We grabbed Missy and ran to the car, only stopping to grab wallet and keys. We have new motion cameras by the front door due to safety hazards in our neighborhood, and we were out on the patio, which is the only other entrance to the apartment. So we knew no one had come into the apartment. It is quite small, and most of the closets and rooms don't have doors on them, so we would see anyone who had gotten in as well. We kinda hoped we would see a notification from our door camera, or saw someone in the apartment, but unfortunately we never did. We are currently still at the hotel, and we can only afford 1 or 2 more nights. We have not slept yet, and we are really scared to even talk about what happened. If anything happens when we get back, I will update you guys. As a child, I was very adventurous in my outlook towards fear and thrill-seeking. I'd watch every horror film I could get my hands on. I'd read the scariest novels in my parents' library. I'd throw myself willingly at anything that might have a chance of scaring me, but nothing ever really came close. Once I got into the upper ages of primary school, I started going out with my friends more and staying out later. My parents were very relaxed with my curfew. They knew me well enough to know I'd never put myself in danger or get into trouble, so I was generally allowed to stay out a lot later than my other friends, who had to be home for around 7 p.m. The park we used to hang around at was further from my house than anyone else's, so I always ended up walking home alone. One night, I impulsively decided to take a different, longer route home that led me past a cemetery. It was the same cemetery that a few of my relatives were buried in, so I was pretty comfortable being there. I stopped to look at the black gates guarding the entrance. They were huge, easily 3 times my height, and were in pretty poor condition. It must have been years since they were painted or had the rust scraped off them. The gates were covered in moss, and the spikes mounting them had pierced an assortment of different coloured leaves, and spider webs covered the tips of them, with threads connecting each spike. I wanted to go in. I don't know why, but something felt as though it was pulling me in. The gates were barred shut in the evenings, so my only way in was to climb. I eventually talked myself into doing it. I was more worried about someone seeing me do it than any danger that might befall me while attempting to get over them. I was a fairly athletic kid, so getting over was no issue, and I was certain I hadn't been seen, even though my weight made the gate rattle loudly and violently. Once I was inside the cemetery, I just walked around, reading the names and ages of the people buried there, taking in when they were born and when they died. It must have been around 20 minutes when I saw a very unique looking headstone. It was about 10 foot tall and was shaped like an angel holding a baby with a young child standing beside her. The faces that had been carved into the stone had been weathered away, leaving them featureless. They were eerie to look at in those surroundings, and with the sun having long since set, there was no noise except the rustling of the trees and the occasional sound of a car driving past the entrance. I knelt at the grave and tried to make out the name of the graves. There were 3 that had been dead for a long time. The name at the top of the list was clearly the mother given her age. The other 2 were younger children. The elder of the 2 had died at the age of 8, while the youngest had only lived for 1 year. The dates of their deaths were the same. All 3 had passed away at the same time. As a 9-year-old, I understood how odd that was, but not that it could have and likely meant they died in a tragic accident or in a murder/suicide. While I was observing the gravestone, I heard a branch snap in the distance behind me. I immediately jolted around and began scanning to see what had caused it. It was tough to see, but I couldn't make anything out. While my back was turned on the grave, the hairs on my neck tingled, like someone had blown on them. It was enough to tell me I should not be there, and I needed to leave. I ran towards the exit and scaled the gates, without worrying how much noise I was making. Once I was over the gates, I began making my way home. Occasionally I glanced back into the cemetery, through the cast iron bars. I was being followed, I was sure of it. The graveyard was pitch black, but I could still make out the silhouette of a person walking alongside me, but much deeper in. I quickened my pace, but the shape kept up, and it now looked closer than before, like it was walking closer towards me, but also still moving sideways. I ran across the road without looking. A car had to slam its brake to avoid hitting me. The driver beeped her horn and glowered at me. I paid her no attention. I was only thinking about getting home as quickly as possible. I ran the rest of the way. By the time I got home, it was pretty late. My mom told me to get washed up and go straight to bed. I did as I was told. I wanted to put my time into the graveyard behind me and move on to a new day. While I was asleep, I kept dreaming about the cemetery and the silhouette that had moved alongside me. Then I dreamt about the silhouette walking through the streets of my neighborhood and heading straight for my home. In the dream, the silhouette headed straight into my house, up the stairs and to my room. I woke from the dream and stared at the ceiling. I could see a small amount of light coming through my door. It was ajar. I never slept with my door open, and once shut, it was impossible for the door to open without turning the handle. My room was as deadly silent as usual, but I could hear someone walking around in the infinite darkness that was the floor space in my room when the curtains were shut. I peeked through the gap in the railing of my bed and could see the silhouette standing by the wardrobe, thanks to the light coming through the small opening of my door. I shut my eyes and tried to regain my composure. I could hear it moving around. The noise stopped, and the usual silence of my room at night returned briefly. It was broken by the sound of my bunk bed steps groaning under the weight of someone climbing them. I heard the first step, then the second, and then the third. I opened my eyes to look and saw the shape looking back in my direction from the top of the steps. For a split second, I was transfixed. It was not a silhouette anymore. It was a woman wearing a black dress with a veil covering her face. Her face had no features, just like the headstone I'd stopped to look at in the cemetery. Even without eyes, I could tell she was looking at me. I threw the covers over my head and hoped that would be enough to hide from her. It wasn't. I felt her edging closer to me. I could feel the weight of her on top of me. It was suffocating, crushing. She moved in the most unnatural way possible, more like a snake than a human. She was shifting up the bed closer to my face until she stopped. I knew her face and mine were now level. I shut my eyes again and told myself that no matter what happened, I would not open them again. My covers were pulled away and I could feel her breath on me. It was odorless and cold, like the breeze that squeezes under a closed door. After what felt like an eternity had passed, I couldn't keep my eyes closed anymore. I opened them and looked at her. She was featureless now. I could see her. I could see her old freckled skin, her pointed nose and thin lips. Her eyes were closed so tightly they looked sealed shut. Only a second had passed before I let out the biggest scream I had ever managed in my life. I wanted to wake every person on my street if possible. The woman slithered away without making a sound, without opening her eyes. I heard my parents' door open and the steps of the bed creaking. My mum and dad burst through my door and flicked my light on. As my eyes struggled to adjust, I could only make out the silhouettes of my parents and the woman. She walked right past them without them noticing. They spent the rest of the night reassuring me that it was not real. My dad took me to my bedroom, and I'd start to calm down. I stepped in and saw a muddied footprint on the carpet. I pointed it out to my dad. He could see it too. I could see on his face he was uneasy about it. He suggested I stayed in their room. Eventually, I managed to fall back to sleep. The next day, my parents agreed to swap our rooms around. I never experienced anything paranormal in the house again. We moved about 2 years later. I know my dad will have convinced my mom to swap the rooms. I didn't find out why until 3 years ago, when my dad passed away from cancer. In the evening of his funeral, me and my family stayed up talking about our lives together. My mom mentioned what happened that night, and I told everyone who didn't know already the story. When I finished it, my youngest sister and my mom shared a look. I asked them what it was for, and my mom told me that my dad had seen something almost identical to my experience. The same woman, the same feeling of her crawling towards him on the bed and just staring at him. He did not tell me because he did not want to frighten me more about the whole situation. And once we'd moved and time had gone by, it was no longer something to even talk about. According to my mom, he'd seen the woman wandering around the house many times after that night. My mom believes in the paranormal, but has never experienced anything herself. But she always said me and my dad were very receptive to things like this. The woman has haunted my dreams so many times over the years, and even now, despite the fact I live hundreds of miles from that home, there are times where I would feel she is watching me still. There are times where I could see a silhouette on the other side of the road. Only when I turn my head, there's nothing or no one there. To this day, I'm convinced that woman haunted my dad and is still doing the same to me. One perfectly ordinary night in the Smith household. After everyone went to bed, Jake had a mysterious visitor. He was just on the edge of dropping off to sleep when he started to hear a shuffling noise in the darkness of his bedroom. As he was trying to figure out what the noise might be, someone or something unseen lay down in Jake's bed right beside him, almost spooning him. He could feel the weight of it on the bed, and the dent it was suddenly making in the mattress. Jake panicked, leapt out of his bed screaming, and quickly turned on the light. On the bed he saw nothing. There were only his normal blankets and pillows, and the dent in the mattress had gone. Bob and Sue heard Jake cry out, so they rushed down the hall to see what was the matter. Jake explained to his parents what had happened, but understandably, they did not really believe him. Bob told Jake he had just had a nightmare, and Sue told him to shake it off and go back to bed. Jake was too freaked out though, and he refused to sleep in his bed. After some arguing, they finally allowed Jake to sleep on the sofa in the living room. The next night, Jake still refused to sleep in his room. Sue told him he was being ridiculous, and she was determined to prove her point. "Okay, fine," she told him. "I'll sleep in your bed tonight. Nothing will happen. And then you'll have to accept that you simply had a nightmare." Jake was fine with this, so long as he did not have to sleep in there again. He went down the hall to sleep next to his dad, and Sue made herself comfortable in Jake's bed. As Sue was about to drop off to sleep, she also heard something. Then suddenly, the same unseen something lay down behind her in the bed. It was exactly as Jake described it to them the night before. Sue could feel the dent in the mattress, as though another person was right next to her in the bed. She jumped out of the bed, flipped on the light, and once again, nothing was there. Nobody slept in Jake's bedroom for a while after that, not until the family's priest came over to bless the house, and especially to bless Jake's room. After that, the ghostly visitor never again tried to climb into bed with anyone in the Smith family. However, one morning, Sue did walk into the living room to discover a woman in a beautiful, full kimono just standing there and staring at her. After a few awkward moments, she quickly faded away into nothingness and vanished, never to be seen again. Years ago, I was living outside of Buffalo, New York, on an old estate on the Lake Erie shore. I rented the carriage house of an old mansion that a doctor and his wife owned. The doctor was a heart surgeon, and they were a well-to-do couple with multiple properties, so they weren't around that often. I liked the solitude of the place. Having just gotten divorced, and although the carriage house was slightly decrepit, I loved living there. The mansion looked over the lake, and my house was closer to the road, off a private drive that went from one side of the estate to the other. The carriage house had been servant quarters for whoever lived there in that mansion at the turn of the 20th century. There was an enclosed courtyard outside my door that was bordered by the back of my house. The carriage barn, which had stored carriages back in the horse and buggy days. A row of empty horse stalls, and a brick wall with an entrance into the courtyard. It was a very cool place to live. The rent was cheap, and there was a private 150-foot beach that was hardly ever used by anyone but me. It was a very cool place to live. The rent was cheap, and there was a private 150-foot beach that was hardly ever used by anyone but me. But it was very isolated if there was nobody staying in the mansion, and there weren't any close neighbours because all the houses along the road were big estates, and a lot of rich people living in the area were not full-time residents. But I was young and brave, and it wasn't a big estate full of decaying spookiness, and I'm a weirdo that likes that kind of stuff, so I was enjoyed to find the place. One night I was coming home late, around 1 a.m, from a friend's house, driving down a street a mile or two from my house. I saw a dark figure up ahead, standing close to the road. I thought that was kind of odd, because it was late at night on the weekday, not exactly party time in the Buffalo South Towns. I started to get a little nervous, because the person was standing as if they were waiting for someone to pick them up. And as I got closer, I could see they were wearing an unusual black shroud-like thing, long and dark and draped, with part of it wrapped around the person's head to look like a hood, similar to someone wearing an abaya and hijab, only much looser, like a bunch of material just wrapped around someone's body. It seemed totally inappropriate to what I knew of the people that lived in the area, to see anybody wearing anything like that, and certainly not outside at 1 o'clock in the morning on a weekday. The person was just standing by the side of the road, looking stooped over and old. I slowed down to a crawl as I approached, worried that the person needed help. Maybe it was an old senile person that had walked out of their house in the middle of the night confused. When I got close enough to see the person, she lifted her head and looked my way, and I saw that it was my ex-mother-in-law. I was absolutely, positively sure it was her. The same grey-brown hair, the same eyes, the same enigmatic smile that had always made me wonder what she was thinking about, but never saying. She raised her hand and waved at me, not to stop and help me wave, but more of a "gosh, it's good to see you" wave. It scared the hell out of me. My mother-in-law had died 3 years previous to when I was driving down that road. I sped up and kept driving, my hand shaking on the steering wheel, but after a few minutes and a few deep breaths, I told myself I should go back and take another look. My mother-in-law had loved me. I could not imagine her ghost would appear seeking revenge on me for divorcing her son, who had not treated me well, to say the least. I drove in a square by making left turns and went down the same road again, but there was no one there. I was too freaked out to go back to my spooky carriage house with the weird sounds and 100-year-old history, with nobody there but me and the ghost I was convinced probably inhabited the place. So I drove to the local all-night Greek diner and sat there for an hour drinking coffee and calming my nerves. When I finally drove home into the courtyard, I could see that someone When I finally drove home and into the courtyard, I could see that something was wrong. My door was standing open, the glass window was broken, the door cracked almost all the way through from one side to the other. Someone had destroyed the door to get into my house. The next day, I found a crowbar in the courtyard, thrown over to the side. The only thing I noticed missing from the house were a few pieces of my clothing, a jar of loose change, and a knife from the kitchen. I was just divorced and not exactly rich. I did not have much worth stealing. It's very scary when someone breaks into the house you live in all by yourself, in an isolated area. They must have driven right into the courtyard and would have been hidden from view whilst they broke in down. They must have driven right into the courtyard and would have been hidden from view while they broke down the door. I called the cops. They never caught anyone. With all the upset of the break-in, it wasn't until hours later that I remembered seeing their dead mother-in-law waving at me from the side of the road, dressed like the Grim Reaper. I'm convinced that she somehow appeared to delay me from going home. That if I had driven straight to the carriage house, whoever the person or persons were who had broken my solid wood 100-year-old door practically in half with a crowbar might have been waiting for me, or I could have surprised them, and that things might have turned out very differently, maybe very badly for me. Now I write fictional horror stories. I even wrote a whole ghost story novel, but this one is 100% real life, true. I swear on my ex-mother-in-law's grave, it really happened. You might even say that seeing Mum by the side of the road that night is part of the reason I write scary stories. So it's my recommendation that people should remember to be nice to their mother-in-law. She might help you out even after she's dead. When I was in 4th grade, we all moved to Mississippi. We moved into a mid-sized 3-bedroom ground-level house. It was pretty old and there were several neighbours living close by. We lived there for several months before anything started to happen. My first memory is getting up in the middle of the night to take a leak. As I was standing at the toilet doing my business, I heard heavy breathing outside the bathroom window. The window itself was very small. It was open, so I could hear crickets and such outside. From the outside, the bathroom window was probably about 11 to 12 feet off the ground. I can remember being a bit scared, but I wasn't petrified at the time. I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep. A few nights later, I heard it again. This time, it was coming from outside my bedroom window. My window was open and very low to the floor. It was so low to the floor, I could duck through it and walk outside, which I had done many times. The breathing was loud, and it was so close, I could have reached out and touched whoever it was. I did get scared then. I got under the sheets and covered my head. The next morning, I asked my brother about it. He and I shared a room. He was on one side and I was on the other. He said he had not heard anything and seemed very disinterested. My grandmother's room was right next to ours, and I asked her about it. She made a joke and ridiculed me, so I didn't ask her anything else. I even told my parents about it, and my dad dismissed it too. Fuck, I say to myself, why won't anyone believe me? The breathing became more pronounced and louder and more frequent. One night it was coming from my closet. Now it was in the house. My bed was right next to the closet. The shelves in the closet doubled as rungs into the attic. And the thought that something could come down out of there and take me up there scared the hell out of me. I went to wake up my parents, and they got angry with me. They told me to go back to bed, so I did. All night long I heard the breathing, and I never did get used to it. I began to plead with my parents to believe me. Then one day, in broad daylight, I was in the living room watching television. My mother was in the kitchen making dinner. My dad was at work. My brother was out of the house, and my grandmother was next door visiting the neighbour. I heard my mother scream and a glass break. I ran into the kitchen just in time to see the screen door slam shut. I followed whoever it was outside, and there was nobody there. My mother said it looked like a hobo, a homeless man who was extremely dirty and tattered. The neighbours said the description sounded like a guy named Homer Rawls or Riles, something like that. Anyway, he died years prior and was a heavy smoker. He made his living doing odd jobs at people's houses. That was the first and last time anyone in my family saw anyone. Heck, that person could have been some transient that stumbled into our house. One night my grandmother turned on every light in the house, knocking on the walls and bedroom doors and telling us to get up. My dad woke up and Grandma said someone was under her bed. My dad, my brother and me all got down on our hands and knees and looked under the bed, but nobody was there. Still, we could hear the loud, raspy breathing that I had been trying to tell everyone for weeks. My brother and I still sleep in the living room with Grandma. From then on, we all went to bed expecting to hear the breathing, but we never talked about it. My parents did not make fun of me anymore either. Eventually, we moved out of the house, and occasionally I could still hear the breathing years after we moved out. We moved back when I was 14, and I haven't heard it since. You never truly know when you are alone. You don't know when someone or something could be watching you, waiting for the right moment